One Piece needs to stop copying Naruto while there's still time. It's not something new. For several years now there's been a feud going on between Naruto fans and One Piece fans. The claims are that many things that were once heavily criticized in Naruto by One Piece fans are now being fiercely defended by those same people. And yes, One Piece seems to be following the exact same path Naruto once took. The most recent manga chapters are proof of that. That's what we're going to talk about in today's video. First, let's talk about the history of rivalry between Naruto and One Piece. We know that the One Piece manga was the best-selling in the world for decades, and this was happening even when Naruto was at the peak of its popularity during the story's climax. However, things were a bit different here in the West. Here for a long time, One Piece was an extremely niche manga that very few people talked about. Naruto was the one everyone wanted to talk about, and back then, around 2012, 2013, 2015, when Naruto was at its peak, I was there talking only about One Piece. So I feel that, for this reason, there was a certain bitterness from the One Piece community about the fact that people only ever talked about Naruto. Because of that, the solution was to badmouth Naruto at all costs, while Naruto fans simply ignored One Piece fans. So we can't even say there was a real rivalry between Naruto and One Piece, since One Piece wasn't even considered a worthy opponent for Naruto, even though it was already the world's best-selling manga at that time. But as we know, things changed after One Piece became extremely popular during the pandemic, when everyone needed something to watch, preferably something long. There was also the new dubbing, which was very well received, and made it easier for the general public to enjoy the series. Then came the announcement of the Netflix live-action adaptation, which caught a lot of attention and, in the end, was also well received, despite some criticism. And we finally got the long-awaited Wano Country arc, which made the manga explode in popularity and even made Toei Animation decide to invest heavily in animating that arc, while previous arcs were kind of done in a half-hearted way. So all of a sudden, One Piece started getting the attention it had never received before, at least here in West. It was funny to see that every time a new arc of One Piece got dubbed, meaning every few months when the anime received a new dubbed part, Naruto fans would show up crying and begging Netflix to dub Naruto Shippuden. So that was the first time the king of shonen from the last decade felt fear. Now it was Naruto fans who began to feel resentment growing in their hearts. And all of that built-up feeling exploded in 2022, when it was revealed that the Gomu Gomu no Mi was actually the Hito Hito no Mi, model sun god. Luffy is killed by Kaido but manages to come back to life by awakening the power of his devil fruit and embodying the essence of Nika. The week that happened, many fans were joking online, saying something like, "So you're telling me that the protagonist died, discovered he had the power of a god related to the sun, came back to life, and beat up the main villain of the arc, and then there's a panel of Naruto saying, 'This guy is just like me,' because that's exactly what happened to Naruto during the Fourth Great Ninja War. Naruto died, discovered he had the power of a god related to the sun, in his case, Ashura, and came back to life to beat the hell out of Madara. That's what happened, right? As far as I remember, that's exactly it. In fact, both are reincarnations of those same divine entities. Naruto is the direct reincarnation of Ashura, and Luffy is also, in a way, the reincarnation of Nika, even if in a slightly different sense. The essence, the spirit of Nika, lived inside that fruit, and by awakening the power of that fruit, Luffy once again brought out the essence of that god, manifested within his body, even though he still recognizes himself as Luffy and remains in control. Around that same time, there were also other posts comparing Luffy with other protagonists, such as Ichigo for example. Quote, "So you're saying the protagonist discovered a new power that he actually always had, completely changing our understanding of his abilities, just like when Ichigo discovered the true identity of Zangetsu." So there were several comparisons showing that Luffy had fallen into the typical shonen protagonist cliché, the one who carries a second entity within himself. But, in defense of One Piece, Oda was very brave in subverting that cliché. Subversion, the famous magic word used by every pseudo-intellectual, myself included. Instead of Luffy, in his Nika form, getting insanely angry like most characters do in similar situations, he actually turns into a clown, literally. Now, one thing that can't be denied is that Luffy's fruit stopped being just a simple rubber fruit and became something far greater. Initially, the impression we always had was that Luffy's fruit was just an ordinary devil fruit, a rubber fruit that only became powerful because he was such a creative kid. But now, we've learned that it's simply the most important fruit in history. Perhaps, as some people theorize, the one that gave rise to all the others. Of course, this conceptual change doesn't take away Luffy's merit up to this point. but it's impossible to deny that the impression it gives is completely different. It's like that classmate or co-worker of yours who's always worked hard suddenly discovering in the middle of their journey that they inherited a millionaire fortune. In this case, the inheritance or power that Luffy discovered he had is very similar to the inheritance or power that Naruto discovered he had for being the reincarnation of Ashura. Another point we can bring up is the question of predestination, because that's another cliché that One Piece has, in a way, fallen into, the archetype of the child of prophecy, just like we had in Naruto. To be fair, One Piece has always had a prophetic tone to it. There's always been talk about a new dawn, and about the person, or at least someone, who would bring that dawn to the world. But what's interesting is that, most of the time, whenever something like that is mentioned, it's always from the perspective of other characters. In other words, what makes people see something special in Luffy is often their own belief in him. For example, I think this boy can bring change. Or, maybe this is the one Roger was waiting for. Of course, One Piece also has more concrete moments of prophecy, like the prediction that a man wearing a straw hat will destroy Fishman Island. That's pure predestination. There's no denying it. But when we look at the world of One Piece as a whole, I really like how Oda plays with this idea of the chosen one and the different interpretations that each character in the universe has about it. For example, Yamato, Kaido's daughter, believed that Ace would be the next Joy Boy, and that was very clear in the subtext of their conversations. Roger himself may have been the closest candidate to becoming the next Joy Boy. He was the only person in centuries to find the One Piece, even before the protagonist did. Man, have you ever stopped to think how insane that is? Instead of Luffy being the only one in centuries to discover the One Piece, there was another man, just a few years earlier, who went there and found it first. The only thing that probably kept Roger from being considered the new Joy Boy was the absence of the Nika Fruit. On the other hand, Naruto also explored the child of prophecy theme, when Jiraiya believed that Nagato might be the one to break the cycle of hatred because he possessed the same eyes as the Sage of Six Paths. Later, he thought that Minato could be the one because of his overwhelming talent, but in the end, he concluded that it was Naruto. So, as you can see, both One Piece and Naruto managed to play really well with the idea of whether or not the protagonist is the true chosen one. In the end, in Naruto's case, it turned out he was. And in One Piece's case, everything also seems to be pointing in that direction. And of course, because the One Piece universe is so much broader and more detailed, there are naturally many other characters who could have been great candidates for the role of the next Joy Boy. Even Kaido himself wondered whether he might be the one. But again, I think both series handled this theme quite well. In short, the Gear 5 revelation caused massive controversy when it came out, but these comparisons with Naruto are only becoming more and more obvious with each new chapter. So let's move on, because One Piece now seems to be trying to create a kind of opposing parallel between three generations. On one side, we have Luffy, Roger, and Joy Boy, and on the other, Teach, Rocks, and Davy Jones. Luffy is the current bearer of the Straw Hat, the carrier of the D initial, the possessor of the Nika Fruit, and the one who will likely bring a new dawn to the world. Roger, the former bearer of the Straw Hat, also carried the D initial, found the One Piece treasure, but was unable to bring that new dawn. And Joy Boy was the first pirate, the original Straw Hat bearer, and the last person to awaken the Nika Fruit before Luffy. On the opposite side, we have Marshall D. Teach, his father Rocks D. Zebek, and his direct ancestor, Davy Jones. All of them share the same D name, but they appear to serve as counterparts to the first three. Luffy is the enemy of Teach, Roger was the enemy of Rocks, and Joy Boy was the enemy of Jones. They all descend from the same D clan. Coincidentally or not, Naruto has a very similar dynamic. On one side, we have Naruto, Hashirama, and Ashura, and on the other, Sasuke, Madara, and Indra. Naruto and Hashirama are reincarnations of Ashura, while Sasuke and Madara are reincarnations of Indra. Quite an interesting coincidence, right? 3 generations where the hero has his villainous counterpart, yet both descend from the same common ancestor. In Naruto's case, Ashura and Indra are brothers, the sons of the Sage of Six Paths. In One Piece, we know that all of them belong to the same D clan, but we still don't know if there's a specific ancestor who gave rise to that clan. At least not yet, because it's very possible that the origin of the D clan began with the sun god, Nika. But since I'm a fair man, and known for being the most impartial in this fandom, I have to admit that One Piece didn't exactly copy Naruto, at least not 100%. It's more likely that both drew inspiration from the same source. Let's go. The concept of the reincarnations of Ashura, which includes Hashirama and later Naruto, and Indra, which includes Madara and later Sasuke, seems to have been heavily inspired by Eastern mythology and religion, especially Hinduism and Buddhism, the two most practiced faiths in Japan. The main points of inspiration include the names Indra and Ashura themselves, which come directly from those mythologies. In them, the Asuras and Devas are classes of divine or spiritual beings who are in constant conflict, representing the eternal cycle of war and peace, the balance between light and darkness, which is a central theme in both anime. There's also the concept of reincarnation, called samsara, the idea that souls, or chakra, in Naruto's case, and will, in One Piece's case, continue to exist through a succession of different lives, maintaining a cycle of destiny. In Naruto, this takes the form of a cycle of hatred that must be broken. And in One Piece, there's also this rivalry within the D-clan that likewise needs to be broken for the sake of a greater good, in this case a new dawn. And finally, we have the opposing paths. Ashura and Luffy represent cooperation, collective strength, the will of fire, freedom, and the sun, while Indra and Blackbeard represent individual power, hatred, or even darkness itself. So both Kishimoto and Oda seem to have drawn from these same philosophical and mythological concepts as the foundation for their stories. Yet it's fascinating how Oda has been building this three-generation pattern exactly like Kishimoto did. And all these coincidences become even more interesting when we remember that the world of One Piece also has its own version of Kaguya, at least in a certain way. A few years ago, we were introduced to a figure named Imu, the god who rules the world from the shadows, mysterious being with a somewhat feminine appearance, distinctive eyes, and someone who's clearly being set up as the final villain of One Piece. More than that, Emus is likely to be the common enemy that will force the two bloodlines, the ones that have spent decades, maybe even centuries, fighting each other, to finally unite against a shared foe. In other words, just as Naruto and Sasuke had to join forces to fight Kaguya, the story of One Piece seems to be heading toward a point where Luffy and Blackbeard, both descendants of the same D-clan, will need to unite to defeat Imu. And beyond that, it's highly possible that once they face and defeat Imu, Luffy and Blackbeard will then have their long-awaited final battle against each other to decide who will inherit the title of Pirate King. Exactly like how Naruto and Sasuke fought to decide who would inherit the title of Hokage. It might sound like a bit of future speculation, and maybe it is, but the story of One Piece really does seem to be heading in that direction, and my observation haki has never been sharper. Speaking of foresight, I also believe that, just as Naruto during the Fourth Great Ninja War managed to share his chakra, or rather Kurama's chakra, with all his allies, it's very likely that Luffy will be able to do something similar in the final war of One Piece. In the great final battle, Luffy may share his Nika form or power with all his crewmates. Now, I've got to give Oda credit for introducing Imu way back in 2019 if I'm not mistaken, which means almost 10 years before the end of One Piece. Unlike Kishimoto, who only introduced Kaguya at the last possible minute deep into extra time, right before the penalty shootout. Anyway, I think that since both Naruto and One Piece are long-running shonen battle series with hundreds of chapters, some elements are naturally bound to overlap whether intentionally or not. At the end of the day, I think that out of all the points I've mentioned in this video, the most problematic one is probably the Nika Fruit twist. The three-generation pattern, One Piece's own Kaguya, I think Oda has handled all of that really well, but it's always funny to see how some cliches that were completely torn apart when they appeared in Naruto suddenly get a huge amount of leniency and excuses when they show up in One Piece. Well, this is a video I've been wanting to make for months, and because of the latest One Piece chapters, I finally decided to do it. Of course, it's more of a light-hearted drama kind of video, a bit more relaxed, you know? Just a few points that are worth discussing. But of course, there's always room to dive much deeper into the conversation. That's why I want to know your opinions down in the comments. And once again, don't forget to leave your like and make sure you're subscribed with the notification bell turned on, so you'll be notified whenever the next One Piece videos come out here on the channel. Alright then, see you next time, goodbye.